On this episode of Newt's World, more than a century after he dominated American politics, Woodrow Wilson still fascinates. In his new book, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn, Congressman Chris Cox offers a panoramic reassessment of Wilson's life and his controversial role in the movements for racial equality and women's suffrage. A vivid picture of Wilson emerges, variously influenced by politics, shifting social mores, and his own lived experience. Wilson is not the flawless paragon of legend, but a complicated progressive whose deep-seated prejudices scarred not only his own legacy, but the broader social landscape of 20th century America. Here to discuss his new book, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, an old friend who I served with in Congress, former Congressman Chris Cox. Chris, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Well, it's really a pleasure.
When last I saw you, you were doing a variety of very busy things, including chairing the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. You'd had a very significant role in the U.S. House. You had been a senior associate counsel to the president. And now here we have this great book. How did all those personal experiences in the real world affect how you approached thinking about Wilson?
Well, of course, Wilson himself, as a writer and scholar, historian yourself, has been a consequential president throughout the 20th century and the 21st. He will always be consequential, whatever one makes of him. So he stood out, as a candidate for a biography for those reasons alone. But I also got interested in Wilson because of his role in women's suffrage. Ever since I was in law school, I'd been interested in how women got the vote and why it took so long. In the early 1970s, I wrote an article for the Harvard Law Review about the first Supreme Court case to hold that the 14th Amendment applied to sex discrimination, what we now call gender discrimination. The 14th Amendment, of course, is the part of the Constitution that guarantees equal protection of the laws. And that summer, I had a long talk with my grandmother that began when I asked her, what was the first presidential election you voted in? We didn't usually talk politics, as my grandmother, but I was just curious, and she looked at me as if I were obtuse. Her tone of voice said it all. 1920, that was the first time we could vote. And of course, I immediately realized what a dumb question I'd asked. The 19th Amendment, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, wasn't approved until just a few months before the 1920 election. So I asked her, who'd you vote for? And she said, Harding. Naturally, Republicans were the ones who got us the vote. And that was something I'd never heard before. And it was actually true in Minnesota, where she lived in 1920. A Republican legislature and governor had adopted women's suffrage by state law earlier in 1920, ahead of the Anthony Amendment. But I then later learned, while it was true that Republicans were the earliest supporters of women's suffrage, going all the way back to Reconstruction, and in Congress they supported it in significantly greater numbers than Democrats, even as late as 1920, there were many Democratic supporters as well in the states and in Washington, D.C. So the story turned out to be much more complicated and to me much more interesting. So when I retired from law practice, which I had returned to after Washington, I dove into this research and found it just fascinating. And it was left out of all of the standard Wilson biographies.
Well, I have to confess, I was surprised. I had no idea how strongly he felt that women should not vote.
And it was very closely connected to his views on race. His views on women, which started out being sort of very traditional, a woman's place is in the home, that sort of thing, mellowed over the years. He had 3 daughters, and they were suffragists themselves, 2 of the 3, fairly actively, even while he was president of Princeton and then president of the United States. But he still harbored views, even as late as the middle of his presidency, leaning towards, it would be better if women didn't vote. But he kept those to himself. Publicly, he was in favor of women voting, but by the state method, states only, not a federal amendment. And the reason he opposed a federal amendment, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which had been introduced all the way back to Reconstruction year after year in Congress, was that it contained federal enforcement, which would prevent Jim Crow states from keeping black people from the polls. And that he expressed, fairly directly in private.
One of the things that's most surprising is how clearly he is for protecting segregation and is, in essence, anti-black. As you went through all your research, were you surprised by the clarity and intensity of that feeling?
Yes, I was, because it's very easy to imagine that Wilson was a man of his time. Racism was very virulent in the United States and regionally, particularly in the South, but was hardly unusual for white people across the political spectrum to have various degrees of racial prejudice. So coming into it, one might generously think that even though he segregated the federal government, that this was not, a terribly unusual position for someone of his time to hold, but it was in fact. And leaving all presentism aside, not judging him by the standards and mores and our own experience of our own time, looking at him through the eyes of progressives of his time, looking at least Northern progressives, looking at him through the eyes of Republicans of the time, through practical political considerations, he was an outlier. This idea of introducing segregation into the federal workforce for the first time in 50 years, that was really out there. And it's very surprising to see the criticism that he got from people on the left who were his supporters and trying to help him. He stuck to it. That was part of his idea of how the world should work.
But at the same time, as your book points out, he's more flexible about the role of women and women being allowed to vote.
Yes, he came around very gradually, mostly being dragged by public opinion. State after state after state was at least considering women's suffrage, and a dozen states had done so by the time he ran for re-election in 1916. And so the Anthony Amendment was picking up steam, if for no other reason than that. And so he had gradually to move his own position. But privately, inside the White House, he confessed to a woman friend of his, Nancy Saunders Toy, wife of a Harvard professor, who was a house guest at the White House at the time, that he believed that if women voted, that this would destroy home life. Who would do the housework?
Okay. I'm not sure that's a debate I'd want to defend today. When you look at all this, despite his prejudices, as you record in your book, he keeps meeting with women's groups. Why do you think he was unable to avoid meeting with all these groups?
Well, he was very successful politically. I mean, one way to look at his career, having leaped from academia to, a brief stint of a couple of years as governor of New Jersey, but really starting his presidential campaign during his first year as governor, and then finding himself in the White House after 2 years. He's a supernova. So the man knew what he was doing when it came to running for office. He wanted to keep his friends close and his enemies closer. He did that as long as he could, but he got his back up when Alice Paul and the National Women's Party were so directly critical of him. The larger of the two national suffrage groups, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, played a very different game with him, and they were very friendly. And every time he turned them down, they would smile and come back for more later and just keep working on him. Ironically, while those two women's groups were feuding with each other, they were really helping each other because it was the good cop, bad cop approach and the overt criticism of Wilson that was launched at him by the National Women's Party would always give the NASA women, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, an opportunity to say in the press, oh, we don't like their approach. We think they should respect the president and so on. But then they'd get their column inches about how important the Anthony Amendment was.
he gradually warms to the idea. And how much that do you think was a re-election calculation, that he doesn't actually publicly endorse a federal women's suffrage amendment until 1918, so he gets through the 1916 election without having endorsed it, but then he does finally in 1918 endorse it and goes a step further and asks Congress to consider whether women should be admitted to a partnership of privilege and right. That's sort of the breaking point in his own thinking. What do you think drove him to finally cave in and say, okay, I'm going to do this thing that I've been turning down for 6 years?
When you go through the tick-tock of who was meeting with him, what he was saying to them, what he would and would not do, it was very clear that at every juncture he put it off. He tried to stave off the Anthony Amendment for as long as he could. His conversion came about the night before 2/3 of the House of Representatives voted for a constitutional amendment. I don't have to tell you that when 2/3 of the House votes for something, it's probably not politically unpopular. And this is a parade that Wilson reluctantly stepped in front of. He met with a group of Democratic House members the night before. They had asked for the meeting. The meeting almost didn't happen because he wouldn't respond to them. But they got in the night before, and they met for an hour, and they pleaded with him to please not put the Democratic Party in a position where we could be held responsible for losing this thing. They thought they had a dozen votes in hand, but they weren't sure, and they really didn't like the idea that the president might even say something against the Anthony Amendment, so they wanted clarity. And all he gave them was a ghost-written statement of a couple sentences that he would not say in his own voice, but that they would say. They asked him and he said. And then when the DNC tried to put out a press release that had a little bit more texture to it about what the president was thinking and so on, he said, I absolutely refuse to be quoted on it. So it was the most reluctant kind of thing. And then for months after that, he said not a word about the Anthony Amendment. He didn't congratulate the House or remark upon it when it passed the next day. And he tried to stay out of it for as long as he could. And then finally, as you point out, months later, at the instance of his son-in-law, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, he made a last-minute decision on a Sunday to go address the Senate and say he was in favor of the Anthony Amendment as a war measure, because Democrats, they had at the midterm lost control of Congress, and this was going to be their last chance to pass the Anthony Amendment on the Democrats' watch. So it was a very political thing that he did. It was not a matter of the heart.
As you're saying, too, this is in the context of the war. It's fascinating to me that Wilson takes a extraordinarily expanded sense of what the war was about and somehow had to translate it into a moral crusade to justify our involvement. I mean, how do you see the process of Wilson's mind coming to grips with the U.S. and the world and then making a proposal that is profoundly revolutionary in terms of trying to create a supranational organization?
This is, of course, what Wilson is best known for. When he was in Paris, which was an extraordinary thing all by itself because no president had ever done anything like this, you leave the country for 6 months at a time when there was really very little in the way of transatlantic communication. So he was cut off from his country for that period of time. And as the months wore on in Paris, he gradually decided that the League of Nations was really all that mattered. And that's what the United States really needed to get out of the settlement of the war. And so he, in essence, traded off what all the other countries wanted, which was territory and money and so on out of the war, the usual things that European wars were about, for concessions on the League of Nations as he wanted it. And then he was so prideful of his creation when he brought it back to Congress, which he had really not kept informed at all of the process. They had not been included in any way. He insisted that no change be made. So it was a very personal thing. And by not going along with the advice of Democrats in the Senate to accept the so-called mild reservations that had been offered in the deal that would have brought the United States into the League of Nations and allowed us to approve the Paris Treaty, he instructed Democrats to vote against it. And Democrats who actually supported the treaty and actually supported the League of Nations were responsible for voting it down.
If he had accepted the modified treaty, it would have passed, right?
Yes, absolutely.
When do you think that his health began to really break into this and make it more difficult? Because he crisscrossed the country making speeches and trying to build pressure on the Congress. I think he probably ruined his health by the intensity of his campaign. But what's your reading of that whole experience?
No question. It was a very marked break, because by the time he made it back from that trip, which he had to cut short, where he was out evangelizing for the League of Nations in speeches across the country, he was on the verge of a very significant stroke that left him paralyzed, unable to speak, or at least unable to speak with any clarity, couldn't write, couldn't sign documents, really was just disabled in a major way. Then he was kept closeted up for months so that the public could not see him in this condition. The government was left to run itself. And his own personality markedly changed by the accounts of all who were around him. He was natively stubborn. It's why he had gotten in a fight with the Princeton Board of Trustees and had to make the leap into politics at the time. That was part of his personality, but it became 10x when he had this stroke and sequelae afterwards. He became a very unreasonable person, rejected all advice, and of course, he had very little contact with what was going on around him. He was cut off from meetings. His second wife, Edith, tried to protect his health by making sure that she screened him from all of these things. And so the combination of stubbornness and not having any situational awareness put him in this position where the few decisions he made, such as instructing Democrats to vote against his treaty, were very bad decisions indeed.
At what point does he get so sick that his wife basically takes over?
This happens in September after the stroke, and it really marks the end of his presidency. He somewhat recovers. Some months later, he's being wheeled into cabinet meetings where, according to the man who wheeled him in, he sat stunned and speechless. He was really a ghost of his former self.
It's really startling how much power she had in that brief period and how much the Democrats, who really had been on a roll by 1920 with the economic depression and with the fighting over the League, they really get crushed. They go from a remarkably successful 8 years to just throwing it all away in the 8th year. And that has to be a piece of Wilson's legacy.
On the subject of Edith, entire books have been written about her role and about that subject. It's fascinating to speculate about the first woman president or the Machiavellian first lady who secretly manipulates the federal government while her husband's incapacitated, the female Rasputin who convinces the helpless invalid to agree to her own plans for the country. But I think Edith Wilson can be criticized for other things, which I can go into, but I would absolve her of being a power-hungry, illegitimate president operating in the shadows. I say this because that's not what she did. First and foremost, she was concerned about the president's health. And so what she did was keep work away from him. Her great sin was keeping the truth away from the American people. And Wilson's great sin, because I think he had enough presence of mind, even in that condition, to know that he couldn't discharge the duties of the presidency, was to hang on to the job. And of course, the reality of what had happened to Wilson was far worse than anyone in Washington, let alone the rest of the country, could imagine. After that major stroke that he had in October 1919, if anyone had been able just to look at him, they could tell that something had gone terribly wrong. He suffered from double vision, from frequent dizzy spells. All his muscles were weak. His memory was faulty. Edith went to extraordinary lengths to conceal all of that. And she had allies. His personal physician, Cary Grayson, the White House chief of staff, then known as the White House secretary, Joseph Tumulty. It was, a full 4 months that she kept him in seclusion. So her significant function being to keep things away from the president was not really a way for her to impose her will, but simply to protect her husband's health. I just think that the election defeat that the Democrats faced, being one of the worst in American history at the time, probably wouldn't have been avoided had Wilson been himself, but that surely was a terrible ending to his administration that didn't help.
You have this very dynamic figure at the beginning who had been, I guess, one of the 2 or 3 leading political science students, and his book on Congress was considered sort of a landmark in the 19th century. He does emerge as a reform president at Princeton in a very controversial way. He then emerges as the progressive governor of New Jersey, and within 2 years, he's president. It's an extraordinary period. And then it has this sort of tragic ending, and really even before his stroke, he misreads the Congress. He doesn't take any of the Republican leadership with him to Paris. He becomes more and more isolated. And in a way, the last 2 years of his presidency almost unwind all the great history of the first 6 years. And for a long time, we tended to skip past that. But I think as people have looked at it more and more, they realize that there was something profoundly wrong from the middle of 1919 on. But does that sort of fit your sense of it?
It does. I think also you have to notice the sharp line of demarcation between his first term and his second term, because, he had run as the peace candidate in 1916 for his reelect, and that was the popular view. People did not want to enter the European war, at least in the main. That's what got him elected president. The Western states, where most of the women's suffrage states were located, were all thought to be Republican, and women, given the ballot, ended up voting for the peace candidate. That's at least the takeaway of all the major media at the time. In California, where Republican registration was 2-1 over the Democrats, that was supposed to be a gimme. And instead, what happened is that Wilson won the state and therefore the presidency, because if Hughes had won California, he would have become president by a margin of 3,421 votes. Now you have the peace president in Washington, and all of the people who had supported the peace candidate, who were pacifists, that came to Washington to complain because very shortly after his inauguration, he asked for a declaration of war, were shut down. Their civil liberties all denied. He became a very different president in 1917 after his inauguration. And from that point on, it wasn't just he was a war president. It was that he, in unprecedented ways, shut down civil liberties in America, imprisoned his enemies, including women suffragists, nationalized a great deal of what went on in the United States, took over the railroads. We had price controls on most things. We had coal shortages. We shut down manufacturing in the East Coast on regular days. All sorts of disruptions in American life. Runaway inflation. Really huge inflation, nothing like what we're talking about today. And so when Harding comes around and is talking about a return to normalcy, that's what he meant. And that really, I think, was going to happen no matter what, whether or not Wilson had his stroke.
I have to ask you one thing totally off the book, but I remembered that you were a senior associate counsel to President Reagan during the period that included Iran-Contra. That must have been a period of real stress. What was that like?
Well, it was, of course, devastating to President Reagan as the facts became clear of what had happened there. He famously went on television to say that, his heart told him one thing, but the facts told him another. It was the only time that I ever saw President Reagan not look physically vigorous. It obviously took a toll on him. I was in the counsel's office. The counsel's office actually expanded to hire, 80, 100 lawyers that worked in the old executive office building just to respond to all the document requests and that sort of thing. So it was a major distraction from all the other things that the president had to do. Personally, for me, it was actually a quite happy thing that all these other people were assigned to handle Iran-Contra, because then I got to do all the other things in the counsel's office portfolio that had nothing to do with that. I spent a lot of time in meetings on reforming the budget process and things like that. So it was not all bad from a personal standpoint, but yeah, very difficult thing for the country, for the president himself, and for the operations.
Did your lessons being in the executive branch at that level permanently teach you some things that you probably couldn't have learned any other way?
Oh, absolutely. And this was my first job in politics. I'd been a partner in a law firm out in California, and now I'm working as a lawyer for the president in the White House, and I was in my 30s. It was very eye-opening and honestly the most exciting time in my whole working career, just because of those unusual circumstances and so much to learn and so much to see. And President Reagan, who I very much appreciated at the time, I did not appreciate would be so unusual compared to other presidents before and after. So I was really fortunate in that respect.
I want to thank you, first of all, as a friend who served together in the House. It's great to be back with you. You've done interesting work. I somehow would never quite have associated you with this kind of great original historic work. I think Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn, is a terrific book and a very interesting introduction to Wilson from angles that have almost never been covered before. And I want to thank you personally for joining me. We're going to make Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn, available both on our show page, and of course, it's available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. So, Chris, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And since we're sharing some personal thoughts here at the end, I'll say that your book, Gettysburg, a novel of the Civil War, was the first serious book that my son read when he was in junior high, I guess. And that made him a lifelong fan of history. So you have one member of the Cox family who is personally indebted to you in that way. Thank you very much, and really a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you to my guest, Chris Cox. You can get a link to buy his new book, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.